Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, your host. I'll be with you for the next hour. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. LibertyRadioLive.com. Thanks for tuning in. My pleasure to be here. And if you're a regular listener, you know that we're reading and discussing the book, The Vatican Billions. The Vatican Billions by Avro, Manhattan. And we've just began chapter 13 of the book on Friday before the weekend. Chapter 13 is entitled The Catholic Church and the Fabulous Wealth of the Spanish Colonies. And we're dealing with a period of time during the Protestant Reformation, when virtually, seemingly at least, all of Europe had rebelled against the Roman Catholic Church. Protestantism was the new move of God, and it served as a great opportunity to take the land masses that the papacy owned or controlled and strip them from her and put them back into the productive use of the people and the nations. And while Rome, the Vatican, the papacy, was suffering a great material depravity, a depletion of her accumulation of land and wealth and power and influence, while she was suffering in Europe because of the Protestant Reformation, she was working with both fists here in the Western Hemisphere after the landing of Christopher Columbus, on behalf of the papacy, on behalf of the Spanish King Ferdinando and his Queen Isabella, to conquer the Western Hemisphere for the papacy, to make the Western Hemisphere Catholic, to create a Catholic monopoly in the West, and to create a new fiefdom in the West, just like the fiefdom that she had created in Europe and was now suffering loss. So this appears to the papacy to be a divine providence, that at the time that the Roman Catholic Church was suffering such great losses in Europe, she reaped a bounty in the West. And Rome saw the West as her greatest opportunity. Now, these facts affect every single one of us here in the West. And these are areas of discussion and study that are completely ignored in the churches today. But these things that we're going to talk about in this chapter affect every single one of us, and if we're careful to listen and to think about what we're reading, we will discover why we are in the situation that we are in today, and who is responsible. Why are we being stripped of our wealth? Why are we being oppressed by our government? Why does not our government respond to our needs? Whose needs is our government responding to? Well, we can't forget the donation of Constantine and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals that gives the papacy, so they believe, the authority to own and control the world. And we are under that ownership and control. The papacy claimed the West for herself, determined to make it a Roman Catholic monopoly. And it says the task, however, beginning on page 104 of the book, the second full paragraph, it says, speaking of turning the United States, Canada, Alaska, Central and South America into a papal fiefdom, it says the task, however, could not be completed without the full cooperation of the temporal rulers, with the result that from the very beginning, church and state became interdependent. Now, this is the same model. If you've been paying attention, this is the same model under which the papacy controlled Europe. a cooperation, a cooperative between the Roman Catholic Church and the secular powers, the union of church and state. And so long as that union existed and there was no conflict between the church and the state, the church reaped the whirlwind in wealth and material blessings and power and influence. That was her goal here in the West. She had to have cooperation with the secular governments. And it says the collaboration, while immensely beneficial to both, led to the inevitable conflict which had so stubbornly bedeviled their relationship back in old Europe. That is, church and state found themselves at loggerheads as frequently as they had done in the old world. Indeed, at times more often. For since the Protestant Reformation, even Catholic kings had become more daring in their claims to royal independence from the papal yoke, with the result that, to the utter stupefaction and anger of the popes, such rulers, while they fought for the church, at the same time seldom let an occasion go by without putting the interest of the crown before those of the papacy, so that the American colonies soon came to be soon came to be buffeted by two mighty conflicting and greedy authorities, the ecclesiastical and the secular. So it's the same old problems that are cropping up in the West. The papacy, in order to have the conquest that it demands, according to the donation of Constantine, must indeed have the cooperation of the secular government. And it says, but whereas in Europe, the church then was on the losing side, here in the West, she was on the winning side, since she had managed to transform practically the whole American continent into a vast Catholic imperium, a Catholic empire, where her writ was supreme. Because of this, she was determined not to lose her hold, as she had done in Europe. As long as the Spanish crown cooperated, well and good. When it did not, then war between the two ensued. So do you see what's happening? As long as the secular government cooperates with the church, all well and good. If not, there's war. The church militant goes to war. Rome is going to have her land, her gold, her silver, her precious stones and pearls. She's going to own the people, hold them down, suppress them, and rule them and control them, just like the Nicolaitans, the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which God hates. She is going to have her way, and the state is going to cooperate and bring that to a reality, and if they don't, there's war. Now that thesis defines all of history, and we're not exempt. The papacy's never changed. When things don't go Rome's way, there is war. And all the kings of the earth know what the ramifications are if they rise up against the papacy. Do you suppose maybe our government realizes the same thing? They do. Now, right now, we're engaged in war. And it's up to God's people to study history and the Bible and come to the conclusion, who is it really that we're fighting for? Why are we in the Middle East fighting Muslims when they had nothing to do with 9/11? When they comprise no more than 0.6% of the population of this country? What threat is Islam to this country? We have to ask ourselves, in light of history, how can we see behind the facade, the smokescreen, and all the lies of the mainstream media, who are we really fighting for? And who are we fighting? And for whose benefit? Now, Rome's going to make the West a papal fiefdom just like it did Europe. And she's got even a stronger hold on the West than she ever had in Europe, because she saw her failure in Europe, and she's not about to let that same failure take place in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Spanish crown, when they cooperated, all was well and good, but when it did not, then war between the two ensued. War broke out whenever the economic interests of the Roman Catholic Church were endangered. Her possessions, which were increasing with greater rapidity even than they had done in Europe, were closely interlinked with her religious power, generally identified with her hierarchy. Her prelates grabbed lands, real estate, and commercial interests, not only for the church at large, but equally for their dioceses, or indeed for themselves. Such activities, more often than not, were tolerated by the civil authorities insofar as the latter, the civil authorities, benefited as much as the clergy from the status quo, with solid monetary rewards and the prospect of a general stability stretching indefinitely into the future. When, however, the benefits were not reasonably shared, and the church and her hierarchs became too greedy. Remember, the church and her hierarchs, that's the shadow government. There are two governments in every land, the secular power and the Roman Catholic Church. And it says when the benefits were not reasonably shared, and the Roman Catholic Church and her hierarchs became too greedy, then conflict ensued. Sometimes it would remain localized, but often its repercussions reached both Madrid and Rome. So Rome's primarily concerned, and she's ready to wage war anytime the secular power challenges her wealth and influence. Now it says it might be useful to illustrate this by a characteristic case which, while typical of the nature and relations of the ecclesiastical and civil economic interests on a local scale, nevertheless became identified with the general economic and financial state, the cooperation and conflict that existed between Rome and Madrid, at that time the two most influential powers on the American continent. The case is especially significant since it shows a situation which was widespread throughout the vast Spanish colonial empire. Because of its extent, the economic factors were equally of immense importance to both the religious and the civil partners. We refer to the great riots that took place in Mexico City in 1624. The spark which ignited them, although trivial in itself, was nevertheless a significant one. Pres de la Sena, Archbishop of Archbishop of Mexico City, in addition to tending the spiritual welfare of his flock, spent a not inconsiderable amount of energy in furthering his own financial and commercial interests. Remember, that's the primary interest of the Roman Catholic Church, to increase her financial and commercial interests. Riches is what the Roman Catholic Church is primarily concerned with. That's the thesis of this whole book. And it says, among sundry businesses, he ran a private slaughterhouse in the very precincts of the archiepiscopal palace. Its establishment was illegal, and the viceroy requested him to close it. The archbishop refused, saying that the viceroy, that is the secular power, had no power over the head of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, after which he launched a furious attack upon the colonial government. So here's the Roman Catholic Church being challenged, and she's firing right back against the secular power. You have no authority over the Roman Catholic Church. This has been all established in the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals and the donation of Constantine. Remember, the state always must be subservient to the church in Rome's view of the world. And now we have a conflict, similar to many conflicts that erupted in Europe. And it says, while this was going on, a well-known food food profiteer, was found guilty of running a giant grain trust. This was one of the most serious offenses against the state, as by hoarding stocks of staple corn, he had purposely made prices soar to such an extent that the poorer sections of the population suffered real hunger and near starvation. So now we have a man-made food shortage, okay, an artificial shortage. I mean, we see that in this country too, don't we? And it says the merchant was heavily fined by and the police were dispatched to arrest him. It so happened, however, that the accused was an intimate friend of the archbishop's, and the latter encouraged him to resist the arrest. The merchant attacked the police and then fled to a Dominican monastery and asked for sanctuary. That's right, he found refuge in the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was going to protect him. You think the Roman Catholic Church might have had something to do with that artificial shortage that he created to seemingly justify the raising of prices for staple corn? That's how Rome manipulates the markets. And that's why they're protecting this merchant, this food merchant. And it says the viceroy dared not trespass into the monastery. Now this goes back to the sovereignty of the papacy. Every Roman Catholic church, every Roman Catholic monastery, every piece of Roman Catholic property is sovereign. The secular power has no right to search or seize or even enter the sovereign precincts of the papacy. This is established in Roman Catholic canon law. So when Rome's criminals get in trouble with the secular power, they find immunity and refuge in the Roman Catholic churches and monasteries. It says the viceroy dare not trespass into the monastery, but although careful not to infringe upon the religious privileges, rather the immunity of the Roman Catholic Church, he was determined to punish the culprit and threw an armed guard around the premises. Okay, they cordoned the place. And it says the archbishop, further to stultify the viceroy's orders and thus undermine his authority, went ostentatiously to the monastery every day where he visited his friend and advised him to continue to resist, going so far even as to plan his escape. The viceroy, however, remained unmoved and kept the monastery under continuous surveillance. Now it says, realizing that he could not bend the viceroy's will, the archbishop then turned the whole issue into a question of religious versus temporal authority. And Rome loves to do this because she knows every time she does, all the Roman Catholics are going to come to her aid. Now watch how this transpires. It says the viceroy, he asserted, by throwing a cordon of guards around the monastery, was violating the right of sanctuary, and hence the right of the Roman Catholic Church. And his action was a direct threat to his, the archbishop's, religious authority. The government continued to refuse to release the accused. Indeed, it arrested one of the archbishop's notaries for incitement to violence. As a reprisal, the archbishop excommunicated the viceroy, the judges, the soldiers, the guards, and the whole government. So the archbishop just stands up and wipes his hand and say, "You are excommunicated. You are damned unless you reconcile with the church." See the spiritual control? See the immense control that these archbishops have? And what did we learn earlier? That the dioceses, the archdioceses, are the shadow government. And they are put in place to keep the secular power into submission to the papacy. That's how he rules the whole world. The shadow government is every bishopric, every diocese, and every archdiocese of the Roman Catholic Church in whatever land that the Roman Catholic Church practices. And you're seeing it, how it operates. When there's a conflict between the church and the state, the church and the shadow government go to war against the state. And it says, faced with such religious fulmination, the civil authorities found themselves helpless. The matter was no longer a judicial one, but had become the old issue of church versus state. And this has always been the issue. That's why the United States has a separation of church and state. But it's all a facade. The Roman Catholic Church controls the American government just as it controls the governments of all the world. And it says the viceroy, to avoid worsening the situation, appealed to the apostolic judge, who ordered the archbishop to withdraw the excommunications. Now, this is a conflict existing between the archbishop and the apostolic judge. Apparently, the apostolic judge, in his good judgment, decided that the archbishop had gone too far, apparently, and this is justice, okay? Now, it says the archbishop, however, not only refused, but locked up every church building in the capital and laid the whole city under interdict. All sacraments and religious services were suspended. The clergy hurled anathemas, that is, damnations, and the bells of all churches, monasteries, and convents were made to toll incessantly by day and night, as if to announce a most frightful disaster. At such an astounding, never-ending din, the people began to crowd into the streets, in a state of semi-terror, asking the cause of such alarms. The answer was given in the form of a long procession of priests, carrying candles, singing hymns, led by a huge cross draped in black, stopping at the house of each person excommunicated to affix to the door the archbishop's condemnation, placing him outside the church. No one must speak to, help, or befriend any whom the archbishop had condemned. At such a sight, the ignorant populace grew even more alarmed, an alarm which increased when they were told by the priest that they too would eventually be condemned to the eternal fire of hell. This, while the slow and awful tolling of the bells continued unbroken throughout the day and the following night. When finally the terrorized mob could no longer endure this, the archbishop, having made sure that they were ready to follow him and do anything he ordered them to do, in the hope of avoiding excommunication, told them to make ready to march with him against those who had compelled the Roman Catholic Church to use their anathemas against the city. Thereupon he actually marched to the Supreme Court with a mob at his heels in an attempt to intimidate the civil authorities. The court, instead of being intimidated, ordered him to sign a judicial warrant. The archbishop, instead of complying, burst out into insults and incited the mob to use violence. Thereupon the court had him arrested, heavily fined, and officially banished from Mexico City. There's the conflict that existed in Europe. It's brought the same conflict in the United States and all of the West. And we're going to see example after example of this, how the Roman Catholic Church uses its power over the secular power. That's the critical element that we have to understand. We'll be back right after the message. Now, we've got this rebel-rousing archbishop that's created an artificial food shortage to rape the people of their money, causing all kinds of problems, and when he's caught and imprisoned, he excommunicates the whole town, just absolutely condemns them all to hell. And finally raises a great mob in support, and they march into the court, and the court says, no, you're guilty, you're going to jail, you're going to pay a heavy fine, we're going to kick you out of the city. So we have the secular power standing up for the people. You think this is over? No. According to Roman Catholic canon law, the secular power has no jurisdiction over the priest. The secular power cannot bring a charge against a priest. So on his way out of town, he stops in the suburbs, and it says the archbishop excommunicated the whole government anew and blasted the city with a new interdict. This was the beginning of an open rebellion. The mob, fearing they too might be put outside the pale of the church, and you know what that means to a Roman Catholic, to be put out of the church. That means to be put out of heaven. That means to spend eternity in hell. So this mob, in tremendous fear that they might too be put outside the pale of the church for not helping the archbishop, rose to defend religion against the king. See, same old, same old. And it says the vice-regal building was besieged. Nearby heaps of bricks used for the construction of a cathedral were hurled against the palace. When these had gone, the people took to tearing up the paving stones. They're ripping up the streets and stoning the building. And it says, thereupon, led by a priest on horseback and shouting, "Long live Christ! Death to the heretic!" they went to the assault of government headquarters, while another priest, seated on a chair placed on a table and holding the gospel in his hand, absolved of blame and penance all those who had taken part in the assault against the palace. Just, you can damn them in one decree and forgive them of their sins in the other. You see how this works? Blessings and cursings. What does the Bible say about those who issue blessings and cursings? He was literally describing the Roman Catholic Church. There are little hints all throughout the Bible that lead us, now that we recognize who the Antichrist is, what the Roman Catholic Church really is in Bible prophecy, the Bible becomes a new book. There are hints throughout that assure us that we have discovered the biblical Antichrist. Now, it continues, it says, the violence lasted until the next day, when the populace finally stormed the building, set it on fire, and opened the jails. The viceroy's guards opened fire, and many were killed. The viceroy, to save his own life, had to escape in disguise and took refuge in a Franciscan convent. Yes, even the secular power found refuge in a Franciscan convent. Unbelievable. And it says, having defeated those who defied the power of the church, the archbishop, quote, made his triumphant entrance into the city at night, accompanied by more than 4,000 men on foot and on horseback, many of them holding aloft lighted torches, so that it seemed in the midst of the day. Unquote. Now it says, in distant Spain, the riots created a commotion. The king dispatched a royal investigator charged with finding out who was guilty and published an official report. So we've got a congressional investigation going on here. And it says 5 priests were sentenced to the galleys. So we've got a papal legate that's finding fault with the priests and putting them in the galleys. And it says the viceroy was completely acquitted. So who's the real villain here? Even the Roman Catholic Church admits that this archbishop was out of control. And it says, while the issue was settled by the authority of the king, the real controversy between church and state in Mexico, and in fact throughout Spanish America. Now, what is Spanish America? All the Western Hemisphere, except for a portion of Brazil, which was claimed by Portugal. It says, while the issue was settled by the authority of the king, the real controversy between church and state in Mexico, and in fact throughout Spanish America, continued to smolder under the cinders of an uncomfortable truce between the papacy and the most Catholic kings of Spain. The riots of Mexico City, far from being a local dispute, had once more indicated to the civil authorities that it was far wiser to share the government with the church. Let me read that again in case you missed it. it seemed to indicate to the civil authorities, that is our government, that it's far wiser to share the government with the church than to govern without its consent. You suppose that might be a similar motive in our government, to share power with the church so as not to tick off the Pope and have war brought down upon your head? That's exactly what's going on in this country. And it says the state, represented either by the colonial authorities or by the king, generally gave way to avoid the worst, with the result that in the long run the papacy, by turning the screw upon the civil authorities, threatened them either with revolt, Mexico City style, or forcible surrender to her claims, managed to acquire an ever-increasing influence in American society until finally she came to control the social, economic, and hence political life of the Spanish colonies, and thus keep a tight stranglehold upon the state itself. Remember, the Bible says the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the people of the earth are drunk with the wine of that fornication. This is the control of the church over the state. This is the woman riding and controlling the scarlet-colored beast. This is the way of the world. And people often tell me, "Oh, Tom, you talk about the power of the Roman Catholic Church all the time. They don't have any power. They don't have any money. Their priests are pedophiles. They're in the courts defending themselves all the time of pedophilia and paying out these exorbitant judgments against to the victims. The Roman Catholic Church is on the ropes. They don't have any power." Is that the impression you're getting from this book? It's certainly not the impression that I'm getting. It tells me that the civil power is held hostage by the Roman Catholic Church, by Roman Catholics in the country, by bishops and archbishops, and the threat of excommunication and the threat of war if the civil government does not comply with the church's demand. If the secular power will not remain subservient to the spiritual power, the shadow government, the papacy and its bishops and archbishops, there will be war. And that subservience of our government has not only made our government submissive to the papacy, but it's gone leaps and bounds beyond that, and our government has become the literal battle axe for Rome. We're fighting her wars for her. Now it says the repetition of such tactics in the course of a few centuries gave such power to the Roman Catholic Church throughout Spanish America that it can be said without fear of exaggeration that the popes had become the real masters of the new continent. This power was exerted, it should be noted, not merely via the control of political instruments. To have gone too far in that direction might have meant a complete breakdown of the relationship between the Spanish monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church, although ruthless, was too subtle not to understand that means could be employed by which to exert de facto control without depriving the government of the belief that it was the civil authorities who ruled. So Rome has to balance her power in such a way as to control, but yet leave the civil power the appearance of ruling. That's why nobody suspects the Roman Catholic Church of having the power that I insist that she has in this country. They've so well masked the power that the church exerts upon our government. That for all the world it appears that they have no control. But I'm telling you, the Roman Catholic lobby in this country is the most fearsome lobby to our government. As consequently, while it exerted pressure for political control, at the same time it carried on a no less ruthless campaign for the total control of the colonial society in the economic field. Now we're getting into Rome's control of the economy. The colonial hierarchies were encouraged by Rome to utilize their religious authority for economic ends, using the populace according to circumstances to bring pressure against the colonial government, as in the case of Mexico City riots. This policy in the long run proved even more effective than the bid for political control, with the result that whereas in earlier colonial days the weight of the church in political matters rested mainly upon religious pressure, particularly through the use of excommunication, later on it shifted to the pressure she could exert by her sheer economic wealth.
Yes, I'd like to add something to Tom's reading here. It is too obvious that I have to state this now. Tom makes the point, but never speaks of the book, of course, that he also read, that you should compare this with when he speaks of the power the Roman Catholic Church has in that country. And when you go to the wonderful book from Tupper Saucy, Rulers of Evil, that I have here on my archive.org, you can get that for free there, download it, as more than 4,000 people already have. And I have the book in English, in German, and in Dutch on my archive. We just go a few pages into the very first chapter. The very first chapter, Underground Rome, it is called, or Subliminal Rome. Yeah. The Roman Catholic Church is a stage, says Bishop Mandel Creighton in his letters. But that's not the point. The point is that when you read on, you see how, among others, even here mentioned in the book from the end 1990s, Joseph Biden and Joe Kerry already play a pivotal role. It is all the result of the Second Vatican Council, when it was more or less hewn into stone, let's say, that every layman in politics has to do anything to advance the Roman Catholic Church's policy. And if you want to see how they do this, if you want to understand how they do and how they did this in the past and how they do that even today, read the very first chapter of Rulers of Evil. You see, it's only a few pages, but it is absolutely perfect in teaching and telling you what it is all about. So, sometimes Tom makes the point and refers to this book, sometimes he doesn't, but I think just with what he read the last, let's say, 3, 4, 5 minutes, it is absolutely pivotal that you understand the connection to books like Rulers of Evil, because this also deals with the foundation of the United States of America. And this is exactly what Tom is talking about. I mean, he's not even before that, because this is even before the colonies, what he's talking now, in the 15th century, when the colonies started. But you will see in the future what is really meant by that. And that's why I had to interrupt his reading here for a second. So please forgive me. I think Tom will, because I'm just making a comment, and I think that he agrees with me. But I just cannot invite him every time when I do these recordings and put these videos of Vatican Billions from Avro Manhattan is reading from 2011 out. Cannot invite him every time and say, come on, let's do a study on this, let's do some extra comments and extra explanation that you didn't do in 2011. I mean, it would be wonderful, but neither Tom nor I, we really have the time. But I just wanted to make the point. Go to the book Rulers of Evil, look at it in my archive, go buy the book, read it, and just read chapter 1. Just with everything that Tom here just said, read and study chapter 1. And you will see how to the point Tom is in his assertion, how Avro Manhattan is in his assertion in this book, how they all come together and agree with chapter 1 of Rulers of Evil. But now let's continue and listen to Tom.
Now, while she tried to control the government through excommunications, and she bided her time, and she focused all her efforts on getting control of all the economics of the country. And she could literally hold the government to financial hostage. Now, they control the banks. The Roman Catholic Church controls the banks of this country. That's how far they've gone. They control the Federal Reserve Bank. And they can increase or decrease the value of our dollar at a whim. And they've got our country on their knees. Our government is on their knees. Rome can destroy this country economically just by snapping her fingers and manipulating the money market. And not to mention all of her commercial interests in the country. And we've simply got to recognize this fact and accept it and then learn what we can do about it, if anything. Now, this economic wealth was accumulated by sundry devices and the simultaneous use of the spiritual, social, and political privileged status of the church, emphasized by the fact, for instance, that the Catholic clergy were an economically privileged class from the beginning, and that they received, quote, large grants of land from the crown. See, here we have the secular government granting land to the Roman Catholic Church, while many monasteries, cathedrals, and individual prelates were given generous encomiendas, benefits. So now we have the secular power in bed with the whore of Rome. Okay? And it says, in addition to this, the church was enriched through her tithes and frequent gifts and bequests of money and property, parochial fees for marriages, funerals, baptisms, confessions, and for masses, both ordinary and requiem, special collections in honor of some patron saint, alms gathered by the monasteries, dowries given to convents of nuns, and so forth. In other words, Rome's got endless means of income, all hooked to the spiritual necessities of its oppressed masses. And it says tithes and bequests, more than anything else, in fact, tended to enrich the Roman Catholic Church as time went by, so that an increasing proportion of colonial income and colonial capital came under ecclesiastical control, under church control. So we're having the same amassment of wealth taking place in the West that took place in Europe. While the Roman Catholic Church in Europe is being divested of her assets because of the Protestant Reformation, she's building herself up an economic and ecclesiastical monster in the West to rival that which she controlled in Europe. It says, in addition to this, it should be remembered that ecclesiastical capital was free from taxation. Legally, in the early days, virtually always. Can't tax the church. Can't tax the Roman Catholic Church. No, the Roman Catholic Church can tax the state, but the state cannot tax the church. That's canon law. So what you have is the state giving a free ride to the Roman Catholic Church, giving her land and helping her build her institutions and her schools, tax-funded. While at the same time, Rome runs the shadow government that runs the country. And said that's not all. Church buildings, monasteries, ecclesiastical residences, and anything else belonging to the Roman Catholic Church had to be erected for free, the state, as a rule, having to furnish 1/3 to 1/2 of the funds required, while the population furnished the remainder. The Indians always offered their labor without any payment whatsoever as part of their contribution. They were poor, remember, and the only contribution they could make was their own backs and labor to help build these convents and cathedrals. And it says this was not confined to the construction of church buildings. It became the rule in the church's vast tracts of land. The result was that the church in the long run became one of the main instruments through which the impoverishment of the native races continued until these were reduced to complete destitution. Now, what's the policy of the Roman Catholic Church with regard to the heathen natives? They're less than human. And Rome uses them as an asset until they're all used up, and that's the end of them. That's always been Rome's attitude toward the heathen masses, the Aboriginal people. That's why you see the Roman Catholic priests of the Northwest Jesuit province just losing a 166.1 million dollar judgment for raping and sodomizing 450 Native Americans in the Northwest Jesuit province. 450 children. That's what they think of the Indians. That's how they've always treated the Indians. And we've discussed even in the past how the Guarani Indians of the Paraguayan reductions were reduced to abject slaves for the Jesuit priests. And they were mercilessly slaughtered if they rebelled. This is Rome. She soaks the earth with the blood of those who won't bend the knee to the Pope. Now, they reduced these native Mexicans to complete destitution, breaking their backs, building these Roman Catholic churches and monasteries. And he says this caused endless riots, one of the most notable of which was the one ignited by the famed and frenzied Mexican masses, again, in the Mexican capital of 1692. The economic influence of the Roman Catholic Church thus continued to grow until, in some regions, she came to control more of the national wealth than did the government itself. By the end of the colonial period, then she owned an estimated 1/2 of the total wealth of Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Paraguay, and Ecuador, and almost that proportion in all the other Latin American countries, while most of the remaining half was controlled by the clergy through mortgages. So you have a Roman Catholic monopoly. They've monopolized the spirits of all the people and put them in fear of excommunication. Now they own the land. They own the government. They own everything. That's Rome, historically and prophetically. And it says the Roman Catholic Church, having lost more than half of the old world in Europe due to the Protestant Reformation, in this way had not only regained what had been taken from her, she had become the undisputed mistress of the souls, and with them the immense wealth of the New World. You think this is fiction? It's a reality, facts on the ground today. Nothing had changed. Rome's power has only gained an increase. Now, chapter 14 of the book is entitled Revolutions and the Church's Revenues. It says at the close of the 18th and the opening of the 19th century, 3 major hurricanes made the Roman Catholic Church totter upon her grandiose reaccumulation of wealth within the space of just one generation: the North American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Spanish-American War of Independence. These were not only portentous landmarks in the history of Western civilization, they were also three major milestones in the history of the Christendom. For while the revolt of the North American colonies ushered in the United States of America, it simultaneously brought to the fore one of the principles most hated by the Roman Catholic Church, namely the separation of church and state. Rome hates it, and it was particularly and specifically anathematized by Pope Pius IX in his encyclical and Syllabus of Error. He damned it as a heresy to separate the church and the state. The church and the state must be in cooperation. In other words, the state must cooperate with the church to do whatever the church tells it to do. The state must be the slave of the slave master in Rome. The king must be subservient to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the Pope. That's Roman Catholic canon law. And, any king that gets out of line and rebels against the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in Rome gets JFK'd. Nothing's changed. And it says, the principle, having been incorporated within the framework of the fundamental legislation of the new American states, and even more, being an integral part of an independent new Protestant nation, became a beacon for nations old and new to apply to such novel tenet in theory as well as in practice. Indeed, it was destined to exert a most tremendous influence upon Roman Catholicism throughout the Western Hemisphere from its first inception, since it contributed more than anything else to the substantial curtailment of the unchallenged economic aggrandizement of the Roman Catholic Church in the Western regions. This it did, not so much within the United States, where the Roman Catholic Church at that time was a subdued minority, but outside of it. And we'll discuss it more tomorrow on the program.